cowboy crossed a silent street and stood beside a humiliated bride, and the man who abandoned her suddenly looked afraid. Arthur Webb's voice echoed off the church walls as he read from a folded letter. June Parker stood frozen at the bottom of the steps, her wilted wildflowers trembling in her hand. A wagon wheel groaned somewhere behind her. Then, from across the dusty street, a cowboy removed his hat and walked straight through the crowd. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. When he stopped beside June, Arthur's confident smile slipped for just a second, and that was the moment she realized something wasn't right. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from and whether you would have walked away or stayed and faced the whole town. The church bell at Red Mesa Crossing rang once, then stopped. It left a thin sound hanging over the street, above the hitching posts, above the dry wagons, above the red dust that never seemed to settle in that part of Arizona territory. The afternoon sun pressed down hard on the wooden roofs. A team of mules shifted beside the feed store. Somewhere near the blacksmith shed, a hammer struck iron, and then went quiet. June Parker came up the church road alone. Her wedding dress was white, but not the kind of white that came from a fine shop in Tucson or Prescott. She had sewn it herself from cheap cotton bought in pieces from Mrs. Abigail Snow's fabric counter. The left sleeve had a stitch near the cuff that did not sit quite straight. June knew it was there. She had worked on that sleeve past midnight, with a candle burning low and her fingertip bleeding through a pinprick she had not stopped to bandage. In her right hand, she carried a small bunch of desert flowers tied with blue thread. They had looked fresh that morning. By now, the heat had bent them a little. Folks had gathered without admitting they had gathered. Men leaned outside the livery with their thumbs hooked in their belts. Women stood near the general store window, pretending to look at flour sacks and coffee tins. Children watched from the shade of the barber shop porch until their mothers pulled them closer. Even the stage driver, who had no business staying, sat on his high seat with the reins loose in his hands. June kept walking. Her boots made small sounds on the hard road. The hem of her dress brushed the dust. She did not look left or right. Her chin stayed level, though her fingers had tightened around the flowers until the blue thread bit into her palm. Arthur Webb stood at the top of the church steps. His coat was clean. His collar was white. His hair was combed smooth, the way it always was when he wanted people to see him as a man of order. He had one hand tucked against his vest and the other holding a folded letter. The church doors behind him remained closed. That was the first thing June noticed. Not his face, not the letter. The doors. They should have been open. She stopped at the foot of the steps. For one breath, nobody moved. A loose shutter tapped somewhere down the street. One of the mules snorted and stamped at the flies. Arthur looked at her as if she had arrived at the wrong hour. "June," he said. Her name sounded smaller in his mouth than it ever had before. She looked at the closed doors, then back at him. "Arthur." He unfolded the letter. The paper cracked in the dry air. A little stir passed through the crowd. Nobody stepped closer, but everyone listened. Arthur cleared his throat. "I have decided this marriage cannot go forward." June did not move. The flowers bent a little more in her hand. Arthur raised the paper higher, as though the letter itself gave him courage. A man has the right to protect his name, his future, his household. I entered this engagement believing certain things about your character, your intentions, and your honesty. A woman near the dry goods window lowered her eyes. June heard the words, but for a moment they did not seem to belong to the world. They floated there, strange and bright, like sparks from a fire that had not yet touched skin. Arthur went on. He spoke of deception, of impropriety, of a woman reaching above her station. He did not raise his voice, and somehow that made it worse. His tone was neat, polished, careful enough to sound almost sorrowful. After much thought, he said, "I cannot bind myself to a woman who has misrepresented herself and sought advantage through affection." The last word landed hard. Affection. June looked at the man she had expected to marry. She remembered his hand resting over hers at the boarding house table while he asked if she could copy numbers clearly. She remembered him smiling when she corrected a column in the guest ledger. She remembered him saying a woman with a good hand and a quiet nature could make a decent home. Now he stood above her on the church steps, holding a letter like a verdict. Behind June, the town held its breath. No one spoke for her. Mrs. Abigail Snow stood near the edge of the crowd with a brown shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her mouth had gone thin. Her hand rested on the handle of her cloth basket, knuckles pale, but she did not come forward. June saw her. Then June looked away. Arthur folded the paper slowly. "I believe it is best you leave quietly." A wagon wheel creaked in the street. June's throat moved once. She did not answer. She could feel every eye on her dress, on the cheap white cloth, on the flowers, on the place where a ring should have been after the vows. Arthur took one step down. He held out a small velvet box. The lid was closed. "I think this should remain with me." June looked at the box, then at his hand. She had not known humiliation could be so quiet. It did not roar. It did not strike. It stood in sunlight and waited for you to lower your head. She did not take the box. Arthur's mouth tightened. June. Her fingers loosened around the flowers, then tightened again. Across the street, a horse tossed its head beside the rail in front of the land office. A man had been fastening the leather tie to the post. He stopped with the strap still in his hand. Evan Lawson. Most folks in Red Mesa Crossing knew him by sight, and little more. A tall cowboy from Last Ridge Ranch, 33 maybe, sun-browned face, dark hat, a shirt faded at the shoulders, a quiet man who came to town for nails, salt, kerosene, and left before conversation found him. Some said he was poor. Some said he was proud. Most said he was better left alone. Evan looked at June standing below the church steps. He looked at Arthur above her. Then he tied the horse off with one clean pull, took his hat from his head, and crossed the street. The dust made a low sound under his boots. People moved aside before they seemed to know they were moving. He did not hurry. He did not glare. He simply walked through the watching crowd and came to stand beside June. Not in front of her. Beside her. There was a careful space between them. No touch, no claim. Just his shoulder near hers, his hat held low in one hand, his eyes on Arthur Webb. The whole street changed. Arthur blinked once. "Lawson, this doesn't concern you." Evan said nothing at first. June could hear him breathing, slow, even. She could see the dust on his cuffs and a thin scrape across the back of one hand. He smelled faintly of leather, horse sweat, and sun-warmed cedar from a fence line. Arthur gave a short laugh, though no one joined it. "What are you doing? Taking up for her now?" Evan's gaze did not shift. Arthur looked past him at the crowd, as if searching for permission. "A broke cowboy from Last Ridge thinks he has a place in church matters?" The words hung there. Evan put his hat back on, slow and deliberate. Then he spoke. "She's not standing here alone." That was all. No speech, no threat, no grand claim. Just one sentence, plain as a fence post set deep in hard ground. June's hand trembled once around the flowers. A single petal slipped free and fell onto the step near her boot. Arthur's face changed. Not much. Just enough. A small tightening at the corner of his mouth, a flash in his eyes that came and went too quickly for most people to catch. But June caught it. It was not only anger. It was worry. For the first time that afternoon, Arthur Webb looked less like a man ending an engagement and more like a man trying to stop something before it could be said. Evan turned slightly toward June. He did not look at her with pity. That mattered more than she expected. "You want to leave?" he asked. His voice was low enough that the crowd could not make a meal of it. June looked at the church doors, still closed. She looked at Arthur, with his clean collar and folded letter. Then she looked down at the flowers in her hand. The blue thread had cut a faint line across her palm. She breathed in once. "No," she said. Evan waited. June lifted her eyes to the street, to the windows, to every face that had watched and done nothing. "Not with my head down." Evan gave one small nod. He stepped back half a pace, giving her room to move first. June climbed one step, just one, and laid the bent flowers on the church rail. She did not throw them. She did not crush them. She set them there carefully, as though they had done nothing wrong. Then she turned. The crowd opened. June walked down from the church in the dress she had made with her own hands. Evan walked beside her, close enough that no one could pretend she was alone, far enough that no one could say he was leading her. Behind them, Arthur Webb stood on the steps with the folded letter in his hand. And for just a moment, as June passed the land office window, she saw his reflection in the glass. He was not watching her face. He was watching the small cloth bag she carried at her side, the one with her needles, her thread, and the little receipt book she never went anywhere without. June kept walking. But now she knew. Arthur had not only meant to shame her, he had meant to silence her. June understood that before she reached the boarding house. The walk from the church to Mrs. Calloway's front steps was not long, but it felt measured by every window she passed. Red Mesa Crossing had gone back to moving, but not back to normal. Men lifted flour sacks a little too slowly. A woman at the pump let the handle hang in her hand. The barber swept the same patch of porch twice and never looked down at his broom. Evan Lawson walked beside June until they reached the plank walk in front of the boarding house. He stopped there. Not because he meant to leave her, because the door was closed, and both of them saw the small cloth bag sitting on the porch before either spoke. June's bag. It had been set down carefully enough. That almost made it worse. Her brown shawl was folded across the top. One sleeve of her work dress hung out from under the buckle. Beside it sat her tin sewing box, the lid dented from years of use. June stood still. The boarding house curtain moved once. A face vanished behind it. Evan looked at the door, then at the bag. His jaw shifted, but he did not speak for her. June stepped up onto the porch. She tried the knob. Locked. She tried it again, slower this time. Inside, a floorboard creaked. Then Mrs. Calloway's voice came through the door, thin and tight. "I'm sorry, June. I can't have trouble here." June's hand stayed on the knob. "I paid through Saturday." A silence. Then the older woman said, "Your money is in the side pocket." June looked down at the bag. She did not bend right away. The sun hit the side of her face. Her wedding dress, already dusted at the hem, brushed against the porch step when the wind moved. Behind her, Evan remained at the edge of the walk. June lifted the bag by its handle. It was lighter than it should have been. A life that light ought to have been easier to carry. She opened the side pocket and found 3 coins wrapped in newspaper. No note, no apology. She put the coins back. When she turned, Evan was looking down the road toward the east end of town, where the red mesa rose behind the roofs like a wall. "You have somewhere to go?" he asked. June looked past him. The church bell rope hung still in the distance. No. He nodded once as if she had told him the weather. I've got a room at Last Ridge. Her eyes came to him. Evan held her gaze for only a moment, then looked away first. Not out of shame, out of care. You take the room, he said. I'll sleep in the storehouse. June's fingers tightened around the handle of the bag. I don't take charity. I didn't offer any. That made her pause. A wagon rolled behind them, wheels grinding over dry ruts. The driver did not turn his head, but his shoulders leaned as if his ears had. Evan said, House needs work. Shirts need mending. Books need better eyes than mine. You want to stay until you choose different. You can work for it. June studied him. His shirt cuff was frayed. One boot had been patched near the heel. His hands were rough, but clean around the nails, the hands of a man who finished what he started. That is a fair offer? She asked. It is. She looked back once at the locked boarding house door. Then she picked up her sewing box. All right. Last Ridge Ranch sat 3 miles east of Red Mesa Crossing, past the wash where dry grass gathered in pale knots, and the road split around a stand of crooked mesquite. The ride was quiet. June sat on the wagon bench beside Evan with her bag at her feet, and the white dress folded under her shawl as best she could manage. The land opened wider the farther they went. Red stone rose to the north. Silver Bend Creek was only a thin, dark line in the distance this late in the season, half hidden by cottonwoods and dust. A hawk turned slow circles over the ridge. Evan drove with one hand loose on the reins. He did not ask about Arthur. He did not ask what had been in the letter. He did not tell her she was better off. People always reached for words like that when they wanted pain to hurry up and become useful. Evan said nothing. June found she could breathe better in that silence. The ranch house came into view near sundown. It was smaller than she expected. Gray boards, low roof, a covered porch with 2 posts, chamois that leaned slightly toward each other. The corral gate hung uneven, and a length of fence near the south side had been braced with old wagon boards. The well stood near the kitchen door, its rope worn shiny from use. Beyond it, a garden patch had gone to weeds, dry rows barely visible under goat head and sand. A bay horse lifted its head from the corral as the wagon rolled in. Evan stopped near the porch. It isn't much, he said. June looked at the house, the well, the tilted gate, the ridge darkening behind it. It's standing. Something moved in his face, quick and gone. He climbed down first, then stood aside instead of reaching for Hisha. June noticed that. She gathered her bag and stepped down on her own. Inside, the house smelled of coffee, dust, wood smoke, and old leather. There were 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen. A narrow bed sat in the back room with a clean quilt folded at the foot. In the front room stood a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with tin plates, a ledger, a coffee mill, and a blue enamel cup with a chip on the rim. Evan set her sewing box on the table. You can bolt the room from inside, he said, pointing to the door. Latch sticks a little. Lift before you slide it. June nodded. He picked up a bedroll from the corner. You don't need to sleep in the storehouse tonight, she said. Evan stopped. The words had come out before she had weighed them fully. June looked at the floor, then back at him. I mean, she said, this is your house. He waited. She took a breath. The front room is far enough. He studied her for a second, not long enough to make her wish she had said nothing. All right. That was the end of it. By morning, June had changed into her plain brown work dress. The wedding dress was folded at the bottom of the backroom trunk, wrapped in the shawl. She did not look at it after she put it away. Evan left before sunrise to check the north fence. June found flour in a tin, beans in a crock, coffee wrapped in cloth, and a heel of salt pork hanging from a hook. She made biscuits because there was enough lard for them and because kneading dough gave her hands something honest to do. When Evan came back, he stopped in the doorway at the smell. June set a plate on the table. "I'll keep account," she said. "What I use, what I replace." Evan washed at the basin near the door, water dripping from his fingers onto the floorboards. "You don't have to write down every biscuit. I do if I'm working from my room." He dried his hands on a towel and sat. "All right." By noon, she had mended 2 shirts, patched a canvas feed sack, and swept red dust out from under the stove. By late afternoon, she had pulled enough weeds from the garden to find the old rose beneath them. The soil was tired but not dead. She knew the difference. On the second evening, she asked to see the expense book. Evan brought it from the shelf without comment and set it before her. The leather cover had cracked at the corners. The pages smelled faintly of ink and smoke. June lit the lamp and sat at the kitchen table. Evan repaired a bridle near the door while she worked. The small sounds filled the room. Paper turning, leather pulling through his hands, the soft tick of the lamp glass warming. At first the numbers were ordinary. Flour, nails, kerosene, harness repair, 2 sacks of winter feed, payment to Caro and Sons for wire. Then she saw the first one. A debt entry to Royce Supply marked paid in February, entered again in March. She turned back 3 pages. Same figure, same hand, different date. June kept her face still. There was another. Interest added twice on the same note. A delivery charge for hay that had never been listed as received. A notation near the margin. Silver bend adjustment. Below it, a page had been torn out. Not cut. Torn. A rough edge remained near the binding. June ran one finger over it. Evan looked up. She did not speak right away. She turned 2 more pages, then closed the book gently. "Who keeps these records before they come to you?" she asked. "Land office copies some. Supply office sends some. I write what I'm told after. Arthur Webb works at the land office." Evan's hands stilled on the bridle. "Yes." June looked at the ledger again. Outside, the corral gate knocked once in the wind. She opened the book to the torn page and turned it toward him. This was not torn long ago. Evan came to the table. He stood behind the chair, close enough to see, not close enough to crowd her. His shadow fell over the page. June pointed to the words above the tear. "Silver bend adjustment." "What is that?" His face changed then. Not sharply. It settled as though an old weight had found his shoulders again. "Waterline," he said. "Creek rights. My father fought over it before he died." June kept her finger on the page. "Who with?" Evan looked toward the dark window. "Franklin Royce." The lamp made a small sound. The flame leaned and straightened. June closed the ledger. Neither of them said Arthur's name. They did not need to. Later, after supper, June stayed at the table to finish mending Evan's faded blue shirt. The cuff was worn thin, and she had to set the stitches small. Twice the needle caught her fingertip. She wiped the blood with a scrap of cloth and kept working. Evan went out to see to the horses. When June finally folded the shirt, her hands ached. She stood, meaning to wash at the pump, but stopped. On the kitchen table sat a tin basin filled with warm water. Steam lifted from it in a faint thread. Beside it lay a clean towel. Evan was nowhere in the room. June looked toward the door. Through the window, she could see him crossing the yard toward the corral, shoulders dark against the last red of evening. He did not turn around to see if she noticed. June sat slowly. She put her hands into the warm water. The sting in her fingertips softened. Dust lifted from her skin in pale clouds. She kept her eyes on the basin because looking anywhere else felt too difficult just then. Outside, a horse blew softly. The corral gate creaked. June sat in the quiet house with the ledger closed beside her and the torn page still clear in her mind. Arthur had not only broken a promise at the church, he had been covering a trail. And somewhere between those false numbers, that missing page, and the name Franklin Royce, Last Ridge Ranch had already been marked for taking. June slept lightly that night. The wind moved across the mesa after midnight, rattling the loose board near the porch roof. Once she heard a horse shift in the corral. Once she heard Evan's boots outside before everything settled again. The torn ledger page stayed in her thoughts. By dawn, pale light had begun to gather behind the red cliffs east of the ranch. June was already at the stove when Evan came in from feeding the horses. Coffee steamed from the blue enamel pot. Neither spoke for a moment. The quiet between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt occupied. June slid a cup toward him. "You were up before sunrise. So were you." That almost sounded like a joke. Almost. Evan sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup. June opened the ledger again. The page looked no different than it had the night before. Still torn. Still wrong. "Franklin Royce owns the biggest ranch in the territory?" she asked. Evan nodded. "Big enough. And he wants Silver Bend Creek? He wants everything near it." June ran her thumb across the edge of the missing page. "And Arthur works with the land office." Evan looked at the ledger but said nothing. That silence answered enough. 3 days later, June rode into Red Mesa Crossing alone. She needed flour, lamp oil, and thread. At least that was what she told herself. What she really needed was to see how people looked at her now. The answer came quickly. A conversation outside the feed store stopped when she passed. 2 women standing near the bakery lowered their voices. The owner of the dry goods shop suddenly found great interest in arranging buttons. No one insulted her. No one had to. The distance did the work. June bought her flour and crossed the street toward Mrs. Abigail Snow's fabric shop. The bell above the door gave a tired ring when she stepped inside. The shop smelled of cotton, cedar drawers, and old paper. Bolts of cloth lined the walls. Mrs. Abigail Snow stood behind the counter measuring blue calico with a brass ruler. She looked up. For a second, something moved across her face. Guilt. Then it was gone. "Morning, June." "Morning." June picked up a spool of brown thread and turned it between her fingers. Neither woman mentioned the church. The silence stretched. Finally, June said, "You knew Arthur longer than I did." Abigail's hands stopped, only for a moment. Then they resumed folding fabric. "I knew his father." "That isn't what I asked." The older woman sighed softly. Outside, a wagon rolled past the window. June waited. Abigail looked toward the street as if checking whether anyone might hear. Then she lowered her voice. 3 months ago, I came by the land office after closing." June said nothing. There was still a lamp burning. Abigail folded the cloth once more. "I saw Arthur inside." Her fingers tightened around the edge. He wasn't alone. "Franklin Royce?" A small nod. June felt something settle inside her. Not surprise. Confirmation. What were they doing? Abigail hesitated. "A map." June leaned forward. "What map?" "The Silver Bend survey." The room seemed quieter. Even the ticking clock near the window sounded distant. Abigail opened a drawer beneath the counter. For a moment, June thought she had changed her mind. Then the older woman pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed, creased, small enough to fit inside a coat pocket. I kept this. June carefully unfolded it. A receipt. Royce Supply Company. The date sat near the top, the amount near the bottom. June read it twice, then a third time. The number matched one of the entries in Evan's ledger, the one marked as unpaid, except this receipt clearly showed payment, paid in full. June slowly looked up. Abigail swallowed. I should have spoken sooner. Why didn't you? The older woman stared at the counter. Because Franklin Royce can make life difficult for people. June understood. Fear had a way of becoming routine, the same way courage did. She folded the receipt carefully and slipped it into her sewing satchel. Thank you. Abigail looked relieved and frightened at the same time. Be careful, June. June nodded. Then she stepped back into the bright Arizona sunlight. By the time she reached Last Ridge Ranch, clouds had begun gathering over the western ridge. Not storm clouds, just enough to dim the sun. Evan was repairing fence posts near the south pasture. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows. The hammer rose and fell steadily. June climbed down from the wagon and walked toward him. Without a word, she handed him the receipt. He read it, then read it again. The hammer hung loose in his hand. This debt was paid. Yes. His jaw tightened. Years ago, yes. The wind moved through the dry grass. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Evan folded the paper. Royce is inflating the books. June nodded. He's building a case. For what? She looked toward Silver Bend Creek in the distance. For your land. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table long after supper. The ledger lay open. The receipt sat beside it. One by one, June compared dates, amounts, interest charges, supply orders. Some matched, some did not. A pattern slowly appeared. Not mistakes, changes. Small enough to hide, large enough to ruin a ranch. Evan watched her work. The lamp cast a circle of gold across the table. June's brow furrowed slightly when she concentrated. Sometimes she tapped the pencil against the page. Sometimes she stared at the numbers without moving at all. Finally, she looked up. They've been preparing this for years. Evan leaned back. You're sure? Yes. How? She tapped the receipt. Because greedy men get careless when they think nobody is paying attention. For the first time all evening, the corner of Evan's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Close. Outside, darkness settled across Last Ridge. Then came a sound. Sharp. Wood striking wood. Both heads turned. Another sound followed. From the south fence. Evan stood immediately. June was already at the window. Two figures moved in the darkness beyond the pasture. Only shadows. Then one disappeared behind the fence line. The second followed. A moment later came the crack of splitting wood. Evan grabbed his coat. By the time he reached the yard, the riders were gone. Only dust remained drifting across the moonlit ground. June followed more slowly. Together they reached the fence. A section of it had been broken down. Fresh damage. Fresh tracks. Evan crouched beside the prints. June looked at the broken rails. Then something caught her eye. Half buried in the dirt. A scrap of paper. Mud clung to one corner. She bent and picked it up. The moonlight was weak, but she could still make out part of a printed mark. A seal. Faded. Official. Not from a ranch. Not from a store. From the Red Mesa Land Office. June looked toward the dark horizon where the riders had vanished. Then down at the paper in her hand. The fence. The false debts. The missing ledger page. The receipt. the map. For the first time, the pieces began fitting together. And if she was right, Franklin Royce was no longer simply pressuring Last Ridge Ranch. He was preparing to take it. June held the scrap of paper in her hand long after the moon had climbed above the ridge. The broken fence stood behind her. The hoof prints were still fresh in the dirt. And somewhere beyond the darkness, Franklin Royce was already moving his next piece across the board. Evan repaired the damaged rails before sunrise. He worked without complaint, without wasting words. June carried nails, held lanterns, and handed him tools while the first pale light touched the mesas. Neither spoke much. They both understood what had happened. The fence had not been broken by accident. The paper had not fallen there by chance. Someone wanted Last Ridge Ranch weakened. Someone wanted pressure. 3 mornings later, the pressure arrived. A rider came from town carrying a folded notice stamped with the seal of Red Mesa Crossing. The horse was lathered from the road. The man handed the document to Evan and left without conversation. June watched from the porch. Evan opened it. His eyes moved once across the page, then again. Finally, he handed it to her. The paper crackled in the wind. Notice of hearing. Franklin Royce had filed a claim. Outstanding debt. Transfer of property. Review before Judge Walter Finch. The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. 3 days away. June looked up. Evan stood with one hand resting against the porch post. The expression on his face had gone very still. Not fear. Something older than fear. The look of a man who had seen this road before. "My father got one like that," he said quietly. June folded the paper. "This won't end the same way." His eyes met hers. Neither looked away. Friday arrived beneath a gray morning sky. Clouds drifted over the mesas. The air smelled faintly of rain that had not yet decided whether to fall. By the time June and Evan reached town, wagons already lined the street outside the land office. Word had spread. People always came when land was involved. Land meant money, water, families, reputations. The land office sat beside the general store. Its whitewashed walls looked tired beneath years of dust. Inside, every chair was occupied. Men stood along the back wall. Women crowded near the windows. The room smelled of leather, sweat, ink, and old paper. June recognized many faces. Some had watched her at the church. Some had watched her leave with Evan. Now they watched again. Waiting. Arthur Webb stood near the front table. His coat was spotless, his hair neatly combed. Beside him stood Franklin Royce. The rancher filled space without trying. Broad shoulders, silver watch chain, dark vest, the confidence of a man accustomed to owning more than anyone around him. Judge Walter Finch sat behind the long desk. The old judge wore spectacles low on his nose and held a fountain pen between his fingers. He glanced once toward June and Evan, then toward the documents stacked before him. "We'll begin." The room settled. Franklin Royce's lawyer spoke first. A narrow man with a sharp voice and a stack of neatly ordered papers. He explained the debts, the overdue accounts, the interest, the unpaid obligations. One paper followed another. Numbers, dates, signatures. Everything looked official. Everything looked complete. June listened carefully. Evan stood beside her with his hat in his hands. Not once did he interrupt. Not once did he speak out of turn. When the lawyer finished, Judge Finch looked toward Evan. "Do you dispute these claims?" Before Evan could answer, June stepped forward. The movement drew every eye in the room. Arthur smiled faintly, the same smile he had worn outside the church, a smile that assumed the ending was already written. Judge Finch adjusted his spectacles. "And you are?" "June Parker." A murmur moved through the room. The judge waited. June placed her cloth-bound ledger onto the table, then another paper, and another. The receipt from Abigail Snow, the duplicate debt entries, the notes she had copied from Evan's books, the muddy scrap bearing the land office mark. Arthur's smile weakened, only slightly, but June saw it. Judge Finch leaned forward. "What are these?" "Records," June answered. The judge picked up the receipt. His eyes moved slowly across the page. The room remained silent except for paper turning beneath his fingers. "This debt appears paid." It was. The lawyer immediately stepped forward. "One receipt proves nothing." June nodded. "I know." She opened the ledger, then showed the duplicated entries, the repeated charges, the altered interest. The missing page reference connected to Silver Bend Creek. Judge Finch examined each item carefully. The silence inside the office deepened. Arthur shifted his weight. For the first time all morning, he looked uncomfortable. The lawyer cleared his throat. "A seamstress isn't qualified to interpret land records." A few people nodded. June expected that. She had been expecting it all week. Arthur's confidence returned. He folded his hands. Judge Finch looked toward June. "Can you explain how you know these numbers are wrong?" June glanced briefly at Evan, only for a second. Then she faced the judge. The room waited. Arthur waited. Franklin Royce waited. June placed one hand on the ledger and finally spoke. "I know because I copied them myself." Arthur's head lifted. "Fast. Too fast." June continued. "I worked with account books before." She reached into her satchel. More folded notes, more records. The careful habits of a woman who never threw paper away. When Arthur Webb brought documents to the boarding house, he often asked me to make copies. Arthur stepped forward. "That's not relevant." Judge Finch raised one hand. "Let her continue." Arthur stopped. His jaw tightened. June looked directly at him. Not with anger. Not with triumph. Simply with certainty. "You asked me to copy them because you thought I wouldn't remember them." The room was completely still now. June opened another sheet. The original debt wasn't this amount. She pointed. "Nor this one." Another page. And the Silver Bend adjustment was different. Judge Finch frowned. Arthur's face had gone pale. June took a breath. The numbers changed after the copies were made. The old judge slowly removed his spectacles. He stared at Arthur for several seconds, then at Franklin Royce, then back at the papers. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the distant mesas. Not close, not yet. But coming. Judge Finch folded his hands. "Do you have a witness?" The question landed heavily. June felt it immediately. Because this was the gap. The place Arthur had been counting on. The place where the truth could still fall apart. She had records, copies, receipts, memory. But she needed someone willing to stand beside those facts. Someone willing to say what they had seen. June thought of Abigail Snow, the older woman behind the fabric counter, the woman who had spent weeks afraid, the woman who had finally handed over the receipt. Judge Finch looked toward the door. "So far," he said carefully, "these documents raise serious questions." Arthur remained silent, but hope had returned to his eyes. June saw it. The hope of a man who believed one frightened witness would stay home. Judge Finch set the papers down. "If no witness appears, we will recess and continue after review." The room held its breath. June looked toward the entrance. The door remained closed. No movement, no footsteps, nothing. And for the first time since entering the office, uncertainty touched her. Would Abigail come? Or had fear won after all? For a long second, nobody moved. The land office felt smaller than it had a moment before. The air was thick with dust, ink, and anticipation. Outside, thunder rolled again across the mesas, a low sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. June kept her eyes on the door. She could feel Arthur Webb watching her, could feel Franklin Royce waiting, could feel the crowd beginning to lean toward the ending they expected. Judge Walter Finch glanced at the clock on the wall. Then the door opened. Not dramatically. Not with a bang. Just a simple turn of the handle. Every head in the room turned. Mrs. Abigail Snow stepped inside. The old fabric merchant looked smaller than usual somehow, her gray shawl damp from the wind outside. She carried a roll of folded cloth beneath one arm. No one spoke. Abigail closed the door behind her and walked forward. One step, then another. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath her boots. Franklin Royce's face darkened. Arthur's shoulders stiffened. June watched Abigail cross the room. The older woman did not look at Royce. She did not look at Arthur. She looked only at June. There was apology in her eyes, and something stronger than apology. Decision. When she reached the table, she carefully unwrapped the gray cloth. A document appeared beneath it. Old. Folded. Protected. Judge Finch leaned forward immediately. Abigail placed it before him. "I kept a copy," she said. Her voice shook slightly, then steadied. "I thought I might need it someday." The judge unfolded the paper. The room was silent except for the crackle of old parchment. June saw his eyes narrow behind the spectacles. He compared one signature, then another. He checked the seal, the dates, the property markings, the reference to Silver Bend Creek. Minutes passed. Nobody interrupted him. Finally, Judge Finch reached for the documents Franklin Royce had submitted. He placed them side by side. His expression changed. Slowly. The way a storm gathers behind distant hills. Arthur swallowed. Royce shifted in his chair. The judge removed his spectacles. He looked directly at Arthur Webb. "Would you care to explain why these records do not match?" Arthur opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation. Judge Finch turned toward Franklin Royce. "Or perhaps you would like to explain." Royce remained seated. His confidence had begun to crack. Not all at once, but enough. The judge looked down again. Then he made several notes. The scratching of his pen sounded unusually loud. Finally, he set the pen aside. "The foreclosure request is suspended immediately." A murmur swept through the room. Judge Finch raised one hand. Silence returned. "There is sufficient evidence to question the validity of these claims." He looked toward the sheriff standing near the rear wall. "Sheriff Miller." The sheriff stepped forward. "Remain available. I will require further investigation regarding these records." Arthur's face had gone pale. The crowd noticed. People always noticed confidence leaving a man, especially when they had mistaken it for honesty. June stood quietly beside the table. She felt no triumph, no urge to celebrate, only relief. A long breath she had been holding since the church steps. Judge Finch carefully stacked the documents. "This hearing is concluded." Just like that. The room began to move. Chairs scraped. Boots shifted. Voices returned in cautious murmurs. People glanced toward June. The same people who had watched Arthur humiliate her outside the church. Now they avoided her eyes. Not because they looked down on her, because they knew they had been wrong. Arthur remained standing beside the table. For a moment, he looked as though he wanted to say something. An excuse, an explanation, a defense. June never gave him the chance. She picked up her ledger, folded the receipt, placed the papers carefully back into her satchel. Then she looked through the window. Dark clouds had finally gathered over the western ridge. Rain was coming. Real rain. The first good rain in weeks. She turned toward Evan. He had not moved far from her side during the entire hearing. Not once. Not when Arthur mocked her. Not when the lawyer dismissed her. Not when the outcome hung in doubt. Yet he had never spoken for her. Never stepped in front of her. Never tried to become the hero of her story. He had simply stayed. June glanced toward the window again. The road will be mud before long. Evan followed her gaze, then nodded. We should get home. Home. Neither commented on the word, but both heard it. Outside, people stepped aside as they left the land office. Not because they were ordered to, because they wanted to. A few offered small nods. One woman quietly touched the brim of her hat. Mrs. Abigail Snow stood beneath the awning. Rain had begun to fall in scattered drops. June stopped beside her. For a second, neither woman spoke. Then Abigail reached into her basket. She removed a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. Fabric, cream-colored cotton, good quality. I should have spoken sooner, Abigail said. June looked at the cloth, then at the older woman. Yes. Abigail lowered her eyes. June took the package. But you came. The older woman smiled sadly. That seemed enough. The ride back to Last Ridge Ranch happened beneath a steady rain. The dust roads softened. Water gathered in wagon ruts. The scent of wet earth rose from the desert. June sat beside Evan beneath the wagon cover. Neither spoke much. They didn't need to. The storm filled the silence for them. Months passed. The rains came, then spring, then summer. Life returned to Last Ridge Ranch one quiet day at a time. The broken fence became a strong one. The old garden began producing beans, squash, onions, and tomatoes. The well was dug deeper. Water lasted longer. June placed a small sewing table on the porch beneath the morning shade. Neighbors started bringing torn sleeves, worn coats, and children's shirts. Some came for repairs. Some came because they wanted an excuse to talk. Either way, they came. Evan built a wooden hook beside the front door. Simple, hand-carved, strong. The first time June asked what it was for, he nodded toward her ledger. So you don't keep setting it on the table. That was all. But she smiled afterward. One evening near the end of summer, the sky turned gold behind the mesas. The horses stood quietly near the corral. The garden leaves moved gently in the warm breeze. June finished folding a shirt she had repaired. When she stepped onto the porch, she noticed something beside the wash basin. A small bunch of wildflowers. Nothing fancy. Just desert blooms tied together with a strip of leather. She looked around. Evan was leaning against the fence near the gate, watching the horses, or pretending to. June picked up the flowers. The stems were fresh. He must have gathered them on the north pasture. She looked toward him. Evan glanced over. Their eyes met. Neither looked away, not immediately. Finally, June looked down at the flowers, then back toward the road leading into Red Mesa Crossing. The same road she had walked after the church. The same road where everyone had watched her humiliation. The same road where she had thought her future had ended. Now it simply led somewhere else, a place she could visit and leave. Because she no longer belonged to that moment. She belonged here, at Last Ridge. near the garden, near the ledger hanging beside the door, near the cowboy who had crossed a dusty street and stood beside her when nobody else would. Evan pushed away from the fence and walked toward the porch. Slowly. The evening light caught the dust on his boots. June held the flowers in one hand. Neither of them rushed the silence. Neither of them spoiled it with unnecessary words. The best things that had happened between them had never arrived with speeches. A basin of warm water, a repaired latch, a shared cup of coffee, a place at the table, a steady presence, a choice made again and again. When Evan reached the porch, he stopped beside her. Close enough. June looked out across the ranch, the fences, the pasture, the house, the life they had rebuilt. Then she smiled. Small, real. And this time there was no crowd watching, no church steps, no accusations, only the sound of evening wind moving through the grass and two people who had found something stronger than rescue. They had found a reason to stay. The end. And maybe that's why this story lingers long after the dust settles. Because most of us will never stand in a land office fighting for a ranch. Most of us will never ride across an Arizona mesa beneath a stormy sky. But many of us know what it feels like to be judged before we're heard, to have a door close in our face, to wonder whether anyone will stand beside us when life becomes difficult. Imagine yourself in June's place for a moment. Imagine carrying the weight of disappointment, walking away from everything you thought your future would be only to discover that the people who truly matter are often the ones who quietly show up when nobody else does. What stayed with me about June and Evan was never the hearing, the documents, or even the victory. It was the small things. A basin of warm water, a seat at the table, a repaired fence, a handful of wildflowers left without a word. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive as a grand moment. Sometimes it arrives one steady act of kindness at a time. And maybe that's the lesson here. Real love isn't always found in promises. Sometimes it's found in presence, in loyalty, in choosing the same person again tomorrow and the day after that. If this story touched you, I'd love to know, what moment stayed with you the most? And if stories like this bring you a little hope, a little comfort, or simply a quiet place to rest at the end of the day, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more heartfelt journeys, forgotten mysteries, and healing stories waiting just down the trail. Until next time, take care of yourself, and keep a place in your heart for second chances.